It's near the end of 1966. British spy and Soviet double agent George Blake has escaped from HMP Wormwood Scrubs and has fled to the Soviet Union. The docudrama Café Come Home, directed by Ken Loach, has aired on BBC One, becoming influential on public attitudes to homelessness. Actor Ronald Reagan is elected Governor of California, and the singer-songwriter Jeff Buckley is born in California, having been abandoned by his musician father, Tim Buckley. Meanwhile, the Beatles have spent months off from the band following their decision to quit touring and are back in the studio to begin work on their next project when John presents his eerie take on childhood. This is UnBeatled, the show where each episode we delve deep into one song recorded by the Fab Four. We examine the history, writing and recording of the song while our resident musician David Bennett unpicks the lyrics and music. So please me and subscribe, like and comment to UnBeatled with David Bennett and Donnie Campbell on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. Today we look at the psychedelic masterpiece, Strawberry Fields Forever. So David, Strawberry Fields Forever is an incredibly dense song. There's loads to talk about. What do we begin with?
Well, I think we begin where the song begins, with the iconic intro, surely the most noteworthy usage of what's called a mellotron. The mellotron, well, I actually, for those watching on video, I actually have a modern mellotron in front of me, but the classic mellotron was a keyboard instrument where each key activated a individual bit of tape. And on those individual bits of tape, you had a recording of a given instrument performing each note. So, for example, on my mellotron here in front of me, I've got it set to the flute mode. And when I press the E key, it would have played, back in the 60s, a tape of a sustained E note. And it would just keep ringing until you reach the end of the bit of the tape, where eventually, it's going to happen in a sec, it runs out. And that meant, amazingly, you could play all of these tapes as a sort of instrument. Which, this, of course, this is a time before synthesizers, before anything anywhere remotely close to this. So you basically, as a keyboard player, could suddenly play all of these other instruments like flutes. So Paul McCartney, at the beginning of this track, he plays this excerpt here, which is based on the chords of the verse of Strawberry Fields. But he creates this nice little intro from it. And then we get, let me take you down, 'cause I'm going to. And then he uses the pitch function on the Mellotron, because, of course, it had a little pitch dial to glide down as well. So the song instantly kicks off with this unique sound, this new sound, perfectly heralding that this song is the beginning of this new era of the Beatles, the new Beatles sound.
I was going to ask, the Mellotron, is that a new technology of the time? There can't have been many about.
They were sometimes marketed, I think, as sort of an instrument to have in the home, to kind of, because people at that time, they would have had maybe like an organ at home, which had different sounds. And this was another way of having different sounds. And we hear the Mellotron on various Beatles moments. This is by far the most noticeable one. But another one that's very subtle is at the beginning of the continuing story of Bungalow Bill, where you get that really quick bit of sort of Spanish guitar. And that's because although the main purpose of the Mellotron was to be able to kind of play a single note and then you could do what you want with it, you could also use it as just a plain old sampler. So you would press a key and it would play a pre-recorded sample. So at the beginning of Bungalow Bill, that is a sample of a seemingly unknown Spanish guitar performance.
So the Beatles had heard this Mellotron. Was it in contemporary records of the time? Or were they sort of breaking new ground, bringing this weird tape machine instrument into the studio to then, change sort of how we listen to recorded music?
So the Mellotron itself was first devised in 1963, but there were other sort of earlier versions of this concept, one of which was called the Chamberlain. I think the earliest recording or pop recording to use the Mellotron was in 66, and it was a Manfred Mann song. So here in 67, Strawberry Fields is a very early use of Mellotron. Another famous use of Mellotron that would come a couple years later is on Space Oddity by Bowie. And on that, they used the strings sound. And originally, as far as I remember, it was meant to be more of a placeholder for what would be real strings. But actually, they liked how the Mellotron strings sound. And that's that's such a common thing with Mellotrons. It's why I own one today. Even though the whole point of them was to emulate real instruments, they didn't quite emulate them perfectly. So it gives it this sort of slightly uncanny, vintagey sound, which is very sort of desirable.
I suppose that ties in with what John was wanting to achieve with Strawberry Fields Forever. It was an uncanny, eerie throwback to his childhood. It wasn't to be this perfect orchestrated song, despite there being George Martin's score in the song.
Yeah, it has a very dreamy quality. And yes, as you said, this song also, later on, features real orchestral instruments, scored, of course, by George Martin. Later in the song, we get 3 cellos and 4 trumpets in a beautiful arrangement. But the really interesting thing about this song, which many people will already know, is it's sort of Frankensteined between 2 completely different recordings. And among other things, that's why we get 2 palettes of instruments, which are, in the first minute, a very typical Beatles setup. In the first minute, the instruments involve John on rhythm guitar, George on lead guitar, Paul playing the mellotron, and I think also adding bass, and Ringo on drums. Classic setup. But then at the 1 minute mark, the whole thing changes, and suddenly there's no guitar part anymore. The mellotron's actually gone, although it does come back right at the end in the sort of outro bit. And now in its place we have layered up drums, so multi-tracked drums, and this thick cello and trumpet arrangement. The Beatles weren't thinking, okay, we're going to have a band arrangement for the first minute and then we're going to go into this orchestral arrangement. This all happened because this song was effectively recorded twice and then stitched together. So what we basically had at the beginning is the first minute of the song is how the Beatles first set out to record the song in a very typical kind of Beatles style for the time. And that's what was take 7 of Strawberry Fields, and that was basically done. They had went into the studio, created this arrangement with a classic Beatles arrangement, finished, but John wasn't happy with it. So John went to George Martin and in quite a bold move said, that track we've spent the last few days recording, let's do it all again. Let's completely start again. Which, of course, was only possible for the Beatles because they effectively had unlimited studio time, right? Because EMI owned Abbey Road Studios, or EMI Studios. So John Lennon managed to convince George Martin that they would record it again, and this time they'd do it with a score. George Martin would write this cello and trumpet part. They'd do the whole thing again, and they would actually do it faster, and they would do it in a higher key. So the original version they had recorded was recorded in the key of B flat, and then this new version that would be take 26 would be 2 semitones higher in the key of C. And you can actually hear this version online, and it's quite uncanny to hear it. So they finished this entire new version of the track, faster, bigger, orchestral, and John still wasn't happy and basically said, I'd like to have the first minute of the first version we did, take 7, and then I want it to go into this new version we've done, take 26. And George Martin said, well, there's only 2 problems with that. One, the tempo, and one, the key. They weren't in the same key. They weren't in the same tempo. And it wasn't like today with computers where we can freely manipulate the key and the tempo of a song and remix it all together. Back then, the only way to change the key or tempo of a song is with what's called vary speed. So vary speed is when you change the speed of the tape machine. And if you slow it down, everything goes lower in pitch. And if you speed it up, everything goes higher in pitch. So you have to change speed and tempo at the same time. You can't change them independently of each other. And the Beatles had used vary speed a lot before. They had actually already, before they even came up with this decision to splice 2 versions of the song together, they'd already been using vary speed on Strawberry Fields, because at this point, John had got into the habit of recording his vocals at a faster speed. So when they played them back at normal speed, his voice would sound lower and kind of like manipulated, because John famously wasn't very happy with the sound of his voice. He always wanted some sort of effect on it. So they'd already been mucking around with vary speed. And John said, John said to George Martin, well, you'll be able to fix it, and left it to him and Jeff Emerick to sort. And of course, George Martin and Jeff Emerick, being brilliant as they are, managed to use vari speed to slow down the faster, higher pitched recording, the newer one with the orchestration on it, take 26, till it more or less met with the same key and tempo of the first version, take 7. They didn't quite perfectly meet. They seemingly aimed more to unify the key rather than the tempo, which makes sense because you're more likely to notice a change in key than speed. And there is like a bump of about 10 BPM when the cut happens, but it doesn't really matter because they put the cut in a gap in the music where it goes, let me take you down, 'cause I'm going to. So in that gap, that's the moment where it happens. It's at almost precisely 1 minute into the track. And in my opinion, it's hidden in plain sight, but it creates this amazing day and night switch in mood from that first half into the second half, not only because they're completely different orchestrations. The first half is kind of band focused, the second half is cello and trumpet focused, but because the whole track now is hanging out between key centers. It's all been sped up and pitch shifted, and the whole thing has just got this magnificent sort of kaleidoscopic sound.
And that kaleidoscopic sound is something they'd been exploring on Revolver with songs like Tomorrow Never Knows. And this album was something that they would never be able to reproduce live, and they knew that.
Yes.
So a little bit of context around this and going into the studio to record Strawberry Fields Forever is they had been using the studio in a way that had never really been used before. They'd been manipulating it towards the sounds they wanted to hear rather than songs that could be replicated live.
Yeah.
But while they've been recording these albums like Rubber Soul, Revolver, they'd also had many touring commitments, which for them got in the way of this creative spree they were on. So in 1966, they're back on tour. And it feels different this time. They're under-rehearsed. There was only 2 days between finishing Revolver and going back on tour. And there's just a continuation of ill-fated mishaps and moments that made the band question whether they will tour again. And I'll quickly run through them.
Sure.
So John made some maybe poor comments to his friend Maureen Cleave, the journalist, saying that the Beatles were bigger than Jesus. While that was brushed off in the UK press, this, a few months later, got picked up by the US press, and it went down horrendously, especially in the sort of the Bible Belt, the southern part of the United States. There was burnings of the records. Disc jockeys refused to play them. There was threats on their life. And it would overshadow that whole US tour in 1966 to a display of empty seats and boycotts and placards outside their gigs. And this was not long after JFK had been assassinated. So there was a real fear of assassination within the band themselves. When you look at those old videos of the Beatles, they are the most famous people on the planet, and they are getting in and out of cars, walking into hotels. They're on stage with seemingly very little security compared to this sort of modern day and age.
Yeah.
And everywhere else they went, there seemed to be issues. They went to Japan and they were performing at the Budokan, this they call it a spiritual home of martial arts, of sumo wrestling. So there was riots and there was protests against that. They went to the Philippines and they played this gig, and they were invited to a presidential dinner with Imelda Marcos, the wife of the autocratic president Ferdinand Marcos. Then they didn't know they were invited, and they didn't go. And on live TV, there was empty seats showing Imelda Marcos being snubbed by the Beatles. So she sends out her cronies, who harass the Beatles on their day off. And eventually, when they're trying to leave the Philippines, they're pushed around the airport lounge, and they're genuinely in fear of their life. They've not got a police motorcade anymore, and they're bundled onto a plane. And this is where I think George Harrison especially really lets loose and lets rip into Brian Epstein, saying, "I am not doing this again. This can't go on forever." Anyway, with this all in mind, they can't hear themselves when they perform, and no one can hear them, really. There's the video of Shea Stadium when they're playing I'm Down, and John is just playing with his elbow, playing the keyboard, because seems to make no difference whether he's
Yeah.
playing right or wrong. And on August 29th, 1966, they performed their last ever show as a four-piece, or the last ever paid show, at Candlestick Park in San Francisco. So the next few months, they spend some time off doing their own things. Paul composes The Family Way with George Martin. He immerses himself in the counterculture in London, and he even goes traveling. And there's a great story where he goes to France in a disguise with a mustache, like proper A Hard Day's Night scene. And he tries to get into a nightclub and he's not allowed in. So in a bit of a huff, he goes away, takes off his disguise and goes back in. He's allowed in with open arms. George goes to India to continue his teaching of the sitar with Ravi Shankar, and he immerses himself in Eastern mysticism and philosophy while he's there. Ringo, he's more family orientated. He settles in with his wife and his new son, Zach. But John, he travels to Spain to film How I Won the War with Dick Lester, the director of A Hard Day's Night and Help. He was asked to be a part of the film, and it's sort of like a very 60s swinging counterculture film, and it has a sort of general anti-war message, which I think John takes to. And it's there where he writes Strawberry Fields Forever. So with that backdrop, David, what can you tell us about John's writing, going from the acoustic demo, which you can listen to online, into the sort of full band studio recording that we now know?
Why I think this song is such a perfect icon for that move to being a studio band is because that first minute we hear is the earlier take 7. And that's when, as I was mentioning a minute ago, they go for the safer, conventional band lineup that they've always done. 2 guitars, bass and drums and singing. They've got the Mellotron, but beyond that, it's kind of a typical sort of arrangement. But then with the second half of the song, the take 26, that's when they finally realise, wait a minute, we're going to just be in the studio now. We don't have to worry about live performance. We can treat recorded music as a medium onto itself. It's not a representation of a live gig anymore, which sounds obvious to our modern ears here in 2025, but it's not actually something that was done much at the time. It was a whole new idea that you could use the studio as this unique setting to make music that could only exist in that medium. You know, of course, the Beach Boys famously were exploring that sort of idea on Pet Sounds, and other bands were starting to realize this. So there's all sorts of magic tricks on this arrangement on Strawberry Fields. You know, we mentioned the Mellotron, but beyond the Mellotron, we've got all sorts of other little instruments going on. We've got a Suave Mandal, which is an Indian stringed instrument, which you hear just on a couple of occasions between sections. So the Suave Mandal, it's like a bit like a harp instrument of an Indian origin. I haven't got one, of course, but the Mellotron here I've set up to have this sort of kind of a sound that sounds a bit like it. So the bit we're talking about is it goes, and it just acts as that perfect transition between those two sections, between the chorus and verse, and it's just something that you wouldn't bother doing if you were going to perform it live, but here in the studio they can pay attention to those micro details. And you know, even the idea of just including an instrument just for a 2-second moment is something you wouldn't do if you were performing live, because that would make no sense to have a player there just to do that. So it's moments like that which are very unique. Another one, which I'll try and demonstrate to you on the Mellotron, is they used the Mellotron not just for the flute sound, but to create an almost sort of Morse code-esque sound effect. It sounded a bit like this, which was a guitar sound effect. If I hold it long enough, you can kind of hear it sounds like a guitar, but if you do it very short, it sounds like a sort of a Morse code thing. And people have often said that stands for JL for John Lennon. It doesn't. It's just sort of gibberish. And if you listen to all of the different takes that they did of Strawberry Fields, every take had a different combination of dots and dashes. So they weren't particularly trying to get any sort of hidden message there. But of course, people will always try and find hidden messages in Beatles tracks. But yeah, to talk of other unique instrumental things going on here, once we get to the second half of Strawberry Fields, once we're hearing that take 26 orchestral take of the song, beyond the cello and trumpet, we also have multiple layers of drums and percussion. So Ringo is of course doing his normal drumming, but we seemingly have other layers of either toms or maybe timpani. We have other percussion instruments, including a moment where the percussion instruments are reversed, and we get this sort of very, very unique, unique for the time sound of cymbals in reverse. You know, we've almost got used to the sound of reverse things now, but back in the 60s, people were doing this for the first time and sort of discovering these sounds that can't exist in nature. So, yeah, this song is such a great mission statement for the band going forward, that this is what we do now. We make music for the studio, for the LP, and it cannot be, even today, you would struggle to perform this to a live audience.
And the Beatles have discovered this, but it's still got these classic Lennon fingerprints all over it. It feels eerie. It feels brooding. It's got this sort of, is it major? Is it minor? What can you explain to us why Strawberry Fields Forever has that particular sound, that feel, even in the acoustic guitar demo of John Lennon?
Yeah, so this song, it's very easy to focus on the instrumentation, the clever tape cut. But beyond that, it's also a really interesting and unique song. The chord progression is basically a unique chord progression. So, of course, we have that intro, and then we're into the verse, where we're getting this chord progression. Weird chords, and they don't really belong in the same key together. So, it's... Of course, as I mentioned, this song is sort of in between keys, but I'll describe it here as if it's in the key of B flat. So we start with this B flat chord. Let me take you down, 'cause I'm going to F minor 7, which is not first. It's instantly we're outside of the key. We establish the key and then instantly leave it. And then we go to G7. Nothing is real. And we go to E flat. Nothing to get on about. G chord, Strawberry Fields Forever, E flat and B flat. So we never really spend more than 2 bars in one key. We keep flitting between keys, and then even when we get to the next section, so the verse, living is easy with eyes closed, we've technically changed key. So this is very later period, or sort of mid-period John Lennon, where he sort of completely abandons the sort of more conventional sense of being in a key, and he's just throwing chords together and getting these colours, and that results in a truly unique melody, because the chords dictate what sort of melody you can write above. So when you use really kind of weird chords that don't normally go together, you're more likely to get an unusual melody.
And you mentioned the use of the Swar Mandal. We know at the time George had just come back from India, and he was deeply engrossed in Eastern music and Eastern philosophy by then. And that guitar line, it does have that influence that we will hear later on Sgt Pepper and With and Without You. But that guitar line it itself sounds like it could be played on a sitar.
Yeah. The whole sort of presumption that the Beatles drew their knowledge from Western music, from rock and roll, that had been their education up to that point, that goes out the window from this point on, and we really hear that on Sgt Pepper. But yeah, the Beatles, thanks to George, and you know, they also all showed an interest in Indian culture as well, but mainly thanks to George, suddenly had this new source of how to music from the world of Indian music, and it really helped blend their approach. So we're not just getting that classic Western rock and roll anymore. We're getting something more worldly.
And we'd heard that on the contemporaries. We've mentioned this sort of arms race of bands. We've got Pet Sounds from Brian Wilson, which was inspired by Rubber Soul. The Beatles respond with Revolver. Brian Wilson is trying to respond right now. He's creating his Smile project, which he would later scrap. But we've heard with the Rolling Stones on Paint It Black, and that they've used the sitar. It does seem to be this competition, this one-upmanship of musicians at the time.
It's this new culture of we can pepper in all of these flavors because we only have to do it once. We only have to get one good sound one time, commit it to record, commit it to tape, and then it's in there in our sort of palette.
And David, as you mentioned, Strawberry Fields Forever has these tempo differences because of the splice, the cut that George Martin did. But there are also some time signature differences and ambiguities in the song.
Yeah, so something that all of the Beatles, but particularly John, got keen on doing a little bit later on in the career, after the initial Fab Four era, is just randomly changing the time signature. So this song, like most songs, most Beatles songs and most songs in general, is more or less in 4/4 time. So you have 4 beats in the bar. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, as you would predict. But every now and then in this song, there's a bar that only has 2 beats in it or 3 beats in it. And it even changes to something called 6/8 time at one point, which to our ears sounds like a tempo change. It sounds like the song suddenly slows down. And that's the bit where it goes, Strawberry Fields Forever. It's like the tempo suddenly lags. So we have nothing is real, 2, 3, 4. And then we get a bar of 2. Nothing to get hung about. 1. So that is 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. So the nothing to get is a bar of 2, just kind of randomly. And then when we get to the Strawberry Fields Forever, that's going 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4. So on paper, it looks so avant-garde and crazy. I've got all of these time signature changes. But I definitely don't think John was thinking, okay, this bar's going to have 3 beats and this bar's going to have 5 beats. I think so often with these things, and we've talked about this in other episodes, like She Said, I think he was just following the melody he had in his head. So if the melody was only a 2-beat melody, it only needed 2 beats in that bar. And if the melody only had 3 beats, it only needed 3 beats in that bar. So you get this far more fluid sense of meter, but always following the melody.
And before we move on to the rest of the song and discussing the lyrics, we've got to talk about that ending, that psychedelic, awe-inspiring nightmare of an ending. Yeah. Could you explain a little bit about what is happening there and why they chose to do this? Because the music just completely drops, and then it brings it back in with this searing guitar line with these sort of weird offbeat flute sound things. What were they trying to evoke there?
You see it more and more with Beatles songs once they get in this era of being a studio band, is even though you've reached the end of the song, they treat that as an opportunity to just introduce more stuff, like more kind of instruments. So we get the piano come in, and it's what we call a tack piano, where you put things either on the hammers or on the strings to create a more sort of bright percussive sound. So we have Paul playing that chord. It's more or less just one chord on the piano, and then we have and the Mellotron comes back in, but this time it's on a setting where it's playing a sample. I mentioned earlier with Bungalow Bill, where the Mellotron could play little clips of music rather than single notes. And they play, I think it was called swinging flutes. It was this sort of pre-recorded sound, but they then put that in reverse, of course. And that's what that sort of diddle-diddle-doo, diddle-diddle-doo, diddle-diddle-doo sort of sound we have at the end is. So it's creating this crazy sort of soundscape. All the percussion's going nuts. You've got loads of layers of percussion. And in fact, it seems like it was all of the layers of percussion, which meant that the fade out, fade in was used. Because what's amazing is, I mentioned earlier that Strawberry Fields Forever is cut together from 2 takes, take 7, take 26. If you listen to the original version of Take 26, which you can listen to online, you can hear what happened in that fade out section, because that version hasn't been faded in and out. And what you hear basically is all of the percussion in that just kind of becomes a little bit too out of time, a bit too wild. So I suspect that's why they faded out and faded in, because they wanted to kind of get rid of that dodgy bit, but keep the bit at the end. That's my leading theory. I don't know if that's completely confirmed. I know that later on in the career for Helter Skelter, they would do a similar technique of fading in and out at the end. And Ken Scott actually said in a recent interview with Rick Beato that idea to fade in and out came from wanting to give the stereo mix of the song a unique ending compared to the mono mix. So maybe it was a habit the Beatles liked to play with, is just like fade in, fade out, fade in, fade out. Anything they could play with, they would play with. So it might have just been purely another opportunity to get creative.
So we've spoken about the music, but with this later period of Beatles and this later period of John Lennon's writing, we've got to look into the lyrics, because they'd moved past merely writing about boy and girl and she loves you, I love you, the songs that they even described about their fans as being messages to their fans so they would buy the records. This has now moved a little bit more insular. It is looking inside John Lennon's psyche. He's writing stuff in a more abstract manner. He's trying to write before the music comes. He's exercising poetry, really, in some of his songs at this point. So Strawberry Fields Forever is a house and a garden that sits to the back of his Aunt Mimi's house where he grew up, or mostly grew up. And it was a Salvation Army playing fields, and it hosted orphans as well. And this is where John would go to be on his own, to write, to have a smoke, to be away from watchful eyes, and to sort of have a time to himself. And it has really sort of lingered in John Lennon's mind all these years later. I think he probably had a fellow kinship towards the orphans in the Salvation Army house in Strawberry Fields, as his mother had died and his dad had abandoned him. And sort of, he probably related in that way.
Yeah.
But a big part of this also is that he had started taking LSD. He had taken it for the first time the previous year with George and Patty and his wife Cynthia. George's dentist had slipped it into their coffees, and there's a story of them driving very slowly while on it and going to a nightclub and not realizing what was happening, but experiencing all this sort of euphoria. And the LSD by this point has sort of made John question himself, go into himself, and sort of it has thrown up all these memories from his childhood. And that is where this sort of Strawberry Fields Forever has sort of risen to the surface in a way. And you can see that in the lyrics. Let me take you down because I'm going to strawberry fields. Nothing is real. It also plays on this sort of psychedelic euphoria of color. And it harkens back to Lewis Carroll, who was one of John Lennon's favorite authors with the sort of the Adventures of Alice in Wonderland. You know, let me take you down the rabbit hole in a way. And it's just this sort of this psychedelic foray into John Lennon's youth as well as his drug-addled mind, I would say.
Yeah, well, we enter now this period where the Beatles stop, particularly John, stop caring too much about the lyrics making immediate sense, whether that's to himself or to the listener. The earlier songs, as you said, are almost telling little stories. But John Lennon here, you know, I Am the Walrus is also another classic example of it, or Hey Bulldog, is often using imagery where it is almost just imagery. We can't really tease out the meaning, but that creates this whole wonderful sort of dream world to be in. And often I think the Beatles, like any good lyricist, prioritized how the lyric sounded and the meter of the lyric rather than necessarily the meaning. But I know when it's a dream. It just rolls off the music, and it, you know, often I think when you listen to music, you don't pick up on the lyrics really until the second, third, fourth listen. The most important thing about a good lyric is how it sounds, how it feels. One of my personal favourite moments in the lyric here is no one I think is in my tree, I mean it must be high or low. And I've seen John in an interview once mention that this was ultimately him saying that he remembers as a child realising that he was different in some way than the other children, and he thought he must either be mad or a genius. You know, it's either high or low. But no one else was in his tree. You know, no one else was like him. He was on his own. So in this beautiful bit of poetry, there is that meaning there, but it's ambiguous enough that we can all kind of find our own meaning there, even without knowing John's sort of intended meaning.
Well, that's interesting because that lyric actually used to be on my wavelength. No one I think is on my wavelength. So he has changed it to this ambiguous, psychedelic Lewis Carroll-esque iconography in a way, just to either self-consciously to do it, to make this song this dreamlike childhood, you know, everything is in Technicolor, or just as a sort of play on words and abstract, and just to evoke this feeling of a garden, strawberry fields.
Yeah, it may have been a meter decision, because if it said wavelength rather than tree, you've now got the extra syllable there. So maybe it was a more practical thing of like that just doesn't fit, or it was to create more ambiguity, like you said, or a bit of both. But yeah, it's a wonderful lyric that balances meaning with imagery and meter.
And another one I want to talk about, which he changed from his earlier first drafts, is it was originally Nothing to Get Mad About, but he changed it because when John used to jump into Strawberry Fields as a child, his Aunt Mimi used to get upset and say, you can't do that, you're not allowed in there. And he would say, they can't hang you for it. So allegedly, this inspired the line, Nothing to Get Hung About, which I think's a great throwback or callback to a sort of in-joke with him and his Aunt Mimi.
For sure. And it's something that only he and maybe his aunt would get the reference to. But he puts it in there all the same because he's no longer writing for those sort of screaming fans. He's writing for his own expression.
And this expression of childhood would come up again in this sort of era of the Beatles. We've got Penny Lane, which is sort of Paul's answer to this, describing his memories of being a child in Liverpool. John had also explored it earlier on In My Life, but then peppered all over, if you'll pardon the pun, Sgt Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band are these callbacks to being a child. Which is evocative of their northern upbringing. Even the flower clock on Sgt Pepper is a very northern sort of idea, and the bandstand band, and in Getting Better, they're talking about school. The teachers that taught me weren't cool. They do explore it later on, which I think, before we move on, is definitely another thing. This idea of childhood wonder that LSD had sort of imbued in John Lennon himself. So Strawberry Fields Forever, they know they've hit a bit of a gold mine here. They know they've got something special, which Paul even noted himself when John first played it on the acoustic guitar. He said, well, this is really brilliant, John, really brilliant. But there's an issue. They haven't released anything in a few months. Revolver's come out to critical acclaim. People are poring over the lyrics, poring over how they got these sounds in the studio. And Brian Epstein goes, we need more. We want more. He was worried about the rising popularity and impact of the Monkees. And a few months had gone by without a single, without a tour, without an album. So he pesters George Martin and he says, George, we really need a new single. And what they had lying about, what they had ready was Strawberry Fields Forever and Penny Lane. And Brian Epstein went, yeah, that is going to set them apart from the Monkees. The Monkees were still playing off this sort of mock top era Beatles image. The new Beatles, they were mustached, they were hip, they were trendy, they were psychedelic, they had shorter hair. And they released this double A side of Penny Lane and Strawberry Fields Forever. And it's on a picture sleeve, the first time ever for the Beatles, so the fans can see what their new look. And it reaches only number 2. Yeah. It's kept off the top spot in the UK by Release Me by Engelbert Humperdinck, which I just think is an absolutely crazy thing to think that probably the best single that the Beatles have released up to this point, fans go, ooh, I don't know about that. Or maybe Release Me was such a great song at the time. Everyone loved it so much.
But it's short. Yeah, it's telling that at the time there was almost this rejection of this song. It still got to number 2. It wasn't completely rejected, but it defied expectation. It wasn't what the fans were used to. It is quite a wild recording, a heavy contrast to the music they've been doing only a few months prior. So, yeah, I can understand why some fans were not so clued into this yet. They were a bit sort of put off, but of course, it's now revered as a sort of iconic Beatles track. That pairing, Strawberry Fields Forever and Penny Lane, what a pairing.
Yeah, what a pairing. But it didn't go to number 1. It was the first one since Love Me Do not to go to number 1. However, they still wanted to promote it in a great way, in a Beatles way. Now, they obviously knew they couldn't perform this song live, but they had, at this point, there was a trend for the Beatles, which was to send out promotional videos to these late night talk shows, to these music shows across the world, so the Beatles don't have to be there in person, but they can still promote their music to prioritize the sales. And at this time, the Musicians Union had brought in a ban to miming to their own songs on TV. So obviously the Beatles can't perform this live, so they need a way around it. So they create a promo video. We all know that the Beatles are sort of one of the first bands to sort of harness the potential of this music video that would go on to spawn MTV. We all know that. But the Strawberry Fields Forever video is certainly of the time. It's certainly an interesting watch. It's completely mad in a way, sufficiently psychedelic, and they're bringing in these recording techniques they had on the album or on the record into film, into video. They got the Swedish director Peter Goldman. He was phoned by Brian Epstein, and he was out, and he left Sweden later that day to come to London to talk to them. And yeah, the video is crazy. They got the piano, they tie all this glittery string up to the tree, they destroy it, they pour paint over it. It is very much showcasing this new psychedelic, we've turned a corner here, Beatles.
Yeah, and it's once again treating it as a new medium. You know, up until this point, it was all, you know, records were representations of live recordings, of live performances. Video and TV was representations of live concerts and live performances. And now the tide is changing, and people are realizing, wait a minute, we don't have to be shackled anymore by the limitations of reality. We can do whatever we want. And I really think, yeah, for me, Strawberry Fields is my favorite, not only Beatles track, but my favorite song ever. It's just such a unique world of a sound. But amazingly, John Lennon was never quite pleased with Strawberry Fields. He was never quite pleased with any of the stuff the Beatles did. He's such a perfectionist. But there's this interview clip with George Martin where he recalls the time that he met up with John in New York, you know, a few years after the Beatles had broken up, and John was saying to George, you know what, I'd like to re-record everything we did. I don't think anything was ever that good. It was all rubbish. And George Martin says, really everything? What about Strawberry Fields Forever? And John said, especially Strawberry Fields Forever. So maybe if John hadn't been tragically killed, we would have a whole re-recorded back catalogue, as many artists do. You know, Jeff Lynne did it. Paul McCartney has actually re-recorded some of his tracks. And I think the consensus is always, when people re-record tracks, is always, it's not quite as good as the original, but that's the difference between the artist and the audience, is the artist can always hear what they didn't quite manage, whereas the audience can hear what they did manage.
Oh, that's interesting, because the John Lennon, I didn't like Strawberry Fields Forever. There is also a story of him hearing that splice that we spoke about and just going, brilliant, absolutely brilliant. He just muttering that over and over again. So he clearly was totally infatuated with this new sound at the time, but I think it was a classic John Lennon move of dismissing a lot of the Beatles' achievements when he was a little bit older, because he didn't think it was real. He didn't think it was honest enough. Compared to sort of the music they produced in the 70s, authentic enough, with that Primal Scream Therapy and God and Mother, where he's just a tortured soul, or his political albums where he's talking about Ireland or women's rights. So he, I'm going to dismiss John Lennon's dismissal of his own songs here.
For sure, John, as you said, when they first pulled off that tape cut that we were talking about at the beginning of the episode, Jeff Emmerich stood in front of the tape machine so John couldn't see where the tape cut was, because of course back in that time you were literally cutting the tape with a razor blade and then taping it back together, as in with like sellotape, so you could physically see the cut, and John didn't notice it go by, and then they kept playing it all evening because they just loved what they had achieved. So John did love it at one point, but I think his tastes were fickle, and he became obsessed with authenticity, which is part of what the whole Get Back project was. Is he got insecure about the fact that they weren't a real band anymore. They couldn't even play their songs anymore, which is a very old school way of thinking about music now. But at the time, you know, we look back and we talk about the Beatles as if they were they had the great visionaries, and they thought music must not be live anymore. It will be a studio thing. But actually, they were just blagging it. They were just thinking one day ahead and constantly second guessing themselves. And I think that's valuable to remember when we compare ourselves to these people. That they aren't superheroes. They aren't gods. They were just normal working class lads from Liverpool who got an opportunity to play around with a recording studio.
And just quickly, it's one of your favourite songs of all time. It's now regarded really as one of the best songs of all time. We did touch on it, divided opinions, it divided fans. Those promo videos they sent out to people, especially in America, the ones that loved the Mop Tops hadn't quite seen the sort of swinging London transition that we maybe could see in the UK. They see them one day was Mop Tops singing about She Loves You, or I Saw Her Standing There, and then now they're mustached or bearded with short hair. They look older. They look like granddads compared to sort of the 3 years earlier when they were playing on the Ed Sullivan Show. And yeah, it did divide fans. Some thought it was weird. Some thought it was alienating. Only with hindsight can we say, wow, but that wasn't the genius of the Beatles. But at the time, people were going, well, I don't see why they would do this. It's not gonna sell. And I suppose it didn't, because it only got to number 8 in the US as well. But it did herald in the incoming wave of psychedelic pop, pastoral pop that we heard in Pink Floyd and Fairport Convention over the next couple of years. And everyone was on catch-up. The Rolling Stones with She's a Rainbow and such, that album, they're 6 months behind. They're 7 months behind. The Beatles are galloping ahead of the pack. And we've spoken about this before, but Brian Wilson, upon hearing this and the rest of Pepper, the Beatles had got to hit to where he was trying to go before he did, and he was still trying to catch up with Revolver, and now they'd even just upped the bar even more, and supposedly this sort of helped or facilitated his sort of mental deterioration and his scrapping of Smile, his next project to follow up Pet Sounds, which we could probably say is a bit of a romanticized story, as you said to me off camera. But
I'm sure there was more than just hearing Strawberry Fields that led to his decline in mental health. But then, yes, the pressure of having to top that potentially provided an extra level to that.
And it just established the Beatles as the most avant-garde composers in pop. And everyone just looked to them for answers. Like, they knew the secrets of the universe. They weren't just making pop music. They knew something that we didn't, which I think probably was of the time, very much so, of people looking for answers, looking for meditation or philosophy to have the key to life. Nothing encapsulates that sort of looking for answers than people feeling or like they'd heard "I Buried Paul" in Strawberry Fields Forever, when it was actually John just saying cranberry sauce, which then helped propagate this myth that Paul McCartney had died in 1966 and he was replaced by a lookalike. This sort of crazy conspiracy theory, which I had to throw in there because it is wild. But
the Beatles records become more and more detailed at this point, so you wind up with all these random little things, and people love to find meaning where there necessarily wasn't at the beginning. So yeah, Paul Was Dead. It was just one of the things that people managed to pluck out of these songs.
And to just sort of wrap up the impact of this song, Strawberry Fields in Liverpool is now a tourist destination. We've both been. It's got a sort of community centre, tourist.
Yeah, so it's still
shop.
Salvation Army, which is nice, and it's like a community centre, visitor centre. And when I visited it, I walked from where John used to live around the corner to it, so it gives you a real sense of place.
And Central Park has an area named after Strawberry Fields. They call it Strawberry Fields, outside the Dakota building where John Lennon was shot.
Yes, he was shot. The Dakota building literally is on Central Park, so it's basically exactly where he was shot.
And to wrap it all up, there was a Manchester revival band, sort of psychedelic, a mix of acid house, 90s rave music, and old 60s psychedelic music called Candy Flip, which is a drug reference as well. And they did a cover in 1990 that went to number 3 in the UK charts. So it's had a long impact, especially in that 90s era of the mix of 60s pop and acid house.
The 60s were back in fashion in the 90s, and the Beatles were very much that top influence then.
Yeah, and then obviously everything that Oasis tried to do on Standing on the Shoulder of Giants was just a derived version of Strawberry Fields Forever. But it's great to be back with Unbeatled. Hope you enjoyed Strawberry Fields Forever. We will be back with another episode next time. We will be looking at Golden Slumbers and Carry That Weight. But in the meantime, please like, subscribe, comment to Unbeatled with David Bennett and Donnie Campbell. And we will see you next time we're out.
See you next time.